If you were a Sega fan back in the 90s, you've probably heard the term blast processing.
The Sega Genesis has blast processing. Super Nintendo doesn't.
But honestly, it was never really clear if blast processing was even a real thing. At least until recent years, because yes, blast processing is indeed very real, and we have a demo utilizing this technique, which you can download and try for yourself. And what you're looking at right now is an example of blast processing. Yes, it's just a static image, but the color palette is expanded beyond what the Mega Drive can typically deliver in a single image. It's fascinating stuff that could have allowed the system to push beyond its typical color palette limitations. And I'm joined to discuss it by the man behind this demo, Gabriel Morales.
Hey John, pleasure to be here.
Now before we dive in, why don't you first share a bit of history on your Genesis programming?
Well, I got into Sega Genesis hacking around 1997 as a hobby. I was learning computer programming at the time, just starting out, and I always had a interest in video games, and especially video game graphics. So I met up with some people online, and we just kind of kept on talking throughout the years and teaching each other what ultimately became, demo scene, the Sega demo scene sort of stuff. So I've been with that whole scene for about 20 years now. And on the other side, when I was a kid, I of course had a Sega Genesis, and I was at that perfect age where it really became a thing that I became attached to. It was the Playground Wars sort of stuff. And
Yeah, of course. I was also very much in the Sega camp at the time. But blast processing, it was kind of a big deal to the point where even Nintendo kind of had to defend against it,
And Nintendo actually, they ran this article counter to this back in the time in GamePro and EGM called "Smashing the Myth of Blast Processing," and it was framed like a article from the magazine, but it was really an advertisement, and it was just all this stuff about how blast processing was nothing but PR fluff.
Yeah, for sure. What's interesting, I suppose, is that there's kind of a kernel of truth to the backstory about, the existence of blast processing. Basically, technical director at the time, Scott Bayless, was talking with an engineer, Marty Franz, I believe, who mentioned a bug found in the video hardware, which just happened to be the infamous blast processing. You could basically blast data at the video display processor.
Now, to blast data means to send large amounts of data over a comm line serially. In programmers' term, kind of the old antiquated antonym for that would have been snarf.
Right, and then during a meeting with marketing, Scott kind of mentioned this to a marketing guy who obviously liked the term.
Well, all he heard was blast and processor and kind of put two and two together and said, that sounds great, and kind of ran with it. Didn't really understand at all what the guy was telling him about. And so throughout the years, the legend of blast processing has kind of forgotten that, hey, this dude was actually describing a real process, something you could actually do that was apparently neat. But no commercial games ever took advantage of it. There's a problem with the process.
Yeah, and Sega obviously couldn't just say, hey, this doesn't actually work, but yeah, it's pretty cool.
It's interesting. It's something that people probably that people might find fascinating if you live through that time.
Yeah, definitely. But so before we get into how blast processing actually works, maybe you could give us a little background information on how the Genesis draws normally, since this is very important for understanding how blast processing functions.
Well, when you're talking about old video game consoles, you're inevitably talking about CRT televisions. CRT televisions pretty much dictate the timing of the entire Sega Genesis. Rather than sending an entire image to the screen at once, CRT televisions send the image in strips, line by line. This is actually a mechanical process. There's a physical gun inside of the CRT television which sprays electricity at the screen. There are three parts to the way it draws an image. First, there's a phase called active scan, where it's actually sending electricity from the gun to the screen to display color information. Next, there's what's called H-blink. H-blink is the time it takes for the gun to move from one side of the screen back to the other side so it can start displaying more color information. Finally, there's what's called vertical blank. Vertical blank is whenever the gun reaches the bottom of the screen, it needs to move all the way back up to the top left of the screen to start a new frame. These three phases of image composition on a CRT television dictate the way the Sega Genesis works as a computer. This winds up being a pretty restrictive way to draw images to the screen. For one, you're locked to an 8x8 grid whenever you want to make a single change. You can't really change a single pixel on screen. It's actually slow to talk to different pieces of memory inside the VDP due to its convoluted nature by which it draws the screen. To speed things up, the VDP has what's called a DMA controller. DMA stands for Direct Memory Access.
Right.
It's like a direct pipeline from one area of memory on the Sega Genesis to another area of memory. If you're familiar with the water levels of Sonic the Hedgehog, the transparency effect is achieved using DMA. The game waits until the television is at a certain position on the screen, and then it sends a command to start changing the color palettes inside of the VDP's memory.
Oh, yeah. It basically doubles the number of possible colors on the screen and kind of gives the impression of transparent water.
Now, if you've got keen eyes, you might notice that the old Sonic games used to have this flashing sprite at the water line that kind of flickered on and off rapidly.
Yeah, right.
The reason it's doing this is because there's actually a flaw in the DMA design of the VDP. The VDP only has one line to talk to the television, then one line to talk to the 68,000.
Yeah, so why does this happen exactly?
Well, whenever the 68,000 uses that line to communicate, if the VDP is also using that same line to talk to the television, essentially whatever the 68,000 DMAs across that line during active scan gets displayed on television. These are called CRAM dots.
Oh, okay, so the sprites in this case are basically used to mask the CRAM dots. That makes sense.
Now, good programmers could actually hide these CRAM dots by doing all their calculations whenever the gun was off the screen, effectively hiding the pixels.
Right. And that's basically what you see then in the overscan regions of many games. Alright, so how does this relate to blast processing?
Well, over the years, some very smart people figured out that if you carefully time these CRAM dots to appear on screen, you can send pure color information to the television, completely bypassing all the tiles and color palette of the VDP. The problem is, in order to achieve a stable image using this, you have to pretty much guarantee that the 68,000 knows exactly when the television is going to start spraying the first upper left corner of the image. If the 68,000 starts sending color pixel information too early or too late, the image will go out of phase.
Right, and then you basically get a scrambled looking image in return. I think I remember John Burton, who founded Traveler's Tales back in the day, talking about this technique on his YouTube channel, Game Hut.
Traveler's Tales included a tuning feature to try and account for an image being out of phase, but they ultimately found that was too cumbersome for people to deal with. So for many years, nobody could do blast processing. It was essentially impossible to achieve a stable image. You couldn't sync the 68,000 to the CPU.
Alright, so how was the problem solved then?
Well, a few years ago, Oreg866 and Chili Willy sort of stumbled upon this formula which would allow them to sync the 68,000 to the television, always to know with precise timing when and where on the screen they were going to be drawing to. Now, because the television can't actually communicate with the 68,000 directly, they had to do this using a series of commands within the 68,000. Eventually, another user named Nemesis would come through with a logic sniffer and actually figure out why this precise formula would sync things up. What Nemesis explained is that the different parts of the formula worked as a form of error correction, going from large error to small error. The first part of the syncing process is called the vertical blank interrupt, whenever the television sends a signal that it's ready to start drawing in the upper left portion of the screen. Now, depending on what calculations were happening in the Sega Genesis before that, it could be as many as 12 pixels off, meaning that when the 68,000 thinks the gun might be in the upper left-hand corner of the screen, it might actually be 12 pixels before that.
Oh, this is where the command queue stuff you mentioned to me yesterday comes in, isn't it? Where you basically send a bunch of commands to the queue and the VDP runs through them in order, and I think it's first in, first out.
Well, if you send more than 4 commands to that command queue, the VDP will halt. It'll throw its hands in the air and say, "Hold on, I need some time to compute this. Wait," and it'll tell the 68,000 to stop for a second. So it was worked out that by using 13 full commands to this queue would provide just enough time to eat up 12 pixels worth of error accumulation from the V-blank interrupt. Only problem is that V-blank interrupt error accumulation could vary. So if you were doing this without, say, 12 pixels of error, you might add another 1 or 2 pixels in the opposite direction. This required an error correction of 1 or 2 pixels, and that's where that DRAM refresh stuff starts to come into play. The general idea was to aim for 1 pixel after the DRAM refresh. Whenever a DRAM refresh update period occurs, it tells the entire computer to stop what it's doing and wait a second so it can recharge the memory. Thus, if you were 1 or 2 pixels early, it would get delayed to the pixel you assumed you were on in the first place. So the problem is, how do you aim for one of these DRAM refresh update periods? Well, it was worked out that 4 no operation commands, after 13 FIFO writes, would just so happen to aim you right at that DRAM refresh period. Part of the secret of a DMA controller is that it will automatically advance in memory without the programmer's input. So you can point the DMA controller at one portion of memory, say the first value in color RAM, and you can say, I'm going to send you a large string of colors, and after it receives each individual bit of color, it'll move to another memory address. So with one command, you could tell it to fill an entire palette, rather than having to send multiple commands to tell it which palette entry to send to. The first color of the palette is what's called the background color, and if nothing else is displayed on the screen, it'll show up no matter what.
Wow, okay, that's quite a summary, but I think there's probably even a lot more to it than that. So I guess kind of a quick summary then. Basically, as far as I'm understanding it at least, the technique allows you to constantly change background color 0 it is, and stream that color information directly to the VDP, allowing you to select any possible color available to the Mega Drive and use it on a pretty much a per pixel basis, or I guess in this case it's like 2 pixel chunks since you're kind of in chunky resolution mode. It's rather difficult to wrap my head around this whole thing, honestly. It's kind of insane that this was even figured out in the first place, to be honest.
For what it's worth, Nemesis thought that the discovery of such a formula that would achieve sync would never ever occur. It was like a needle in a haystack discovery. Now the cool thing is, the discovery of this alternate graphics mode in the Sega Genesis opens up a lot of possibilities. It takes up the entire 68,000 to do, so you're limited on the number of computations you can do, but the Sega CD adds all sorts of opportunities. In fact, Chili Willy created a port of Wolfenstein to the Sega CD using this method.
Yeah, that seems like there was a lot of potential to use this technique specifically with the Sega CD. Especially since you have more memory available in the Sega CD hardware itself, so it kind of opens up a lot of possibilities there. But yeah, this whole topic is kind of insane, and I'm sure you could go on for like another hour or two about it, but I should probably wrap things up so that we can get this bad boy live.
Just want to say one last shout out to Oreg866 and Chili Willy for the discovery of the sync method, and for Nemesis for explaining exactly why it works and timing, and for Seek for additional information.
Cool. Well, thanks so much for joining me here today then.
Hey John, no problem.
And if you did enjoy it, as always, be sure to like, subscribe, follow us over on Twitter, ring the notification bell, and all that goodness. And until next time, stay retro.
The Sega Genesis has blast processing. Super Nintendo doesn't. So what's blast processing do? What if you don't have blast processing?